Hi. Um, During uh, this state of lockdown and the virus and everything, I've been contemplating and praying to God, and he's he's been persistent with me about sharing my testimony, and this particular verse keeps coming back time and time again to me, and I'll read it. It's from Revelation 12, and it's verse 11. But I'll explain a little bit about where it comes from in a minute. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Now, in the place where this is, basically there's been a war in heaven. Michael's taken on Satan. He's defeated him and thrown him down to the earth. And in the section where he's thrown him down to the earth, and just before Satan hits the earth and goes after womankind, there's a little bit of blurb which is this part is from, and there's it's basically a spoken word said by an angel, and it's been something that's been playing on my mind, that not enough of us share our testimonies, and we have a real hang up about the word testimony and about sharing our testimony, and whether people will like it or whatever. The word testimony in itself basically means story, and in and of itself, it's just your story. So it's something that you can take time over, and you can write it down. I've shared a testimony whereby I've written something down very specific to be read out. But what we tend to do is we tend to share our testimony, and we sort of think that the only testimony we have is the testimony of what we were like before we became a Christian, and when God came into our lives and changed our life. And 99% of the time, the way people do it by sharing their testimony is this: they spend about 90% of the time of sharing their testimony on what they were like beforehand, and God came into my life, and that's it. And this is not good for a testimony. It's basically glorifying what you were and not what you have become. And I've heard some testimonies, and they are all singing, all dancing. People who've been saved from drug abuse and alcoholism and worshipping Satan and all sorts of things. So that then puts a sort of pressure on people to, well, think that their testimony isn't good enough. And I would say that's completely wrong. Your testimony is your testimony. And it's always good enough for God. And it's always good enough for Jesus. And it's always good enough for the angels. So for us to think that our testimony is not good enough and is not a creative enough story is crazy. Because ultimately, it's our testimony. It's our story of how we have come to know God, the creator of our world and the Lord of our lives. And it doesn't matter whether you've become a saved alcoholic or a saved drug addict or a saved prostitute or whatever, or like me, I was just taken to Sunday school as a 6-month-old baby, and was basically brought up in church. Nothing to do with my parents. It was my godmother that took me, and she came down to pick me up every Sunday. And she took me to church, and I loved church. And it was a real passion for me. And I gave my life quite young, and I got baptized at 11. But that's a little bit of my testimony. My testimony's not spectacular. My testimony's not about crazed rave parties or drug-induced this and alcohol-fueled that and satanic rituals or anything like that. It's just a basic testimony. Or is it? Because no testimony is basic. It's your particular story, and we should become proud of our testimony, proud in the right way. We should become passionate about sharing our testimonies, because ultimately it's a weapon against Satan that he can't refute. He can tie you up in loads of legal arguments and tie you up in loads of detrimental arguments when you argue the Bible, but nobody can argue against what has happened to you. And it doesn't really matter whether it's being saved from drugs or just being saved from yourself. It's still being saved. And that is the greatest miracle on this earth. We have been saved from hell. And that in itself is fantastic. And we tend to be ashamed of that. We tend to act as if this is something not worth saying. It's worth shouting from the rooftops. It's a fantastic thing, and as far as I'm concerned, every church service should have at least one testimony. And I've been in church services where they have one after the other, and the preacher doesn't get time to say the word. And that's awesome. Because your testimony can not only shut people up, but it can encourage people. It can take people completely off guard when you share about you. And the other thing is, your testimony is a living thing. Your testimony, when somebody asks you to share your testimony, don't automatically go to the beginning of your Christian life, because you are having testimonies every day of your life. God is interacting with you every day of your life. You've just got to look for it and look for him in your life. And the deeper relationship you have with Christ, the more you'll understand. And it took me years to understand this. I went for years just sharing about how Christ came into my life, which I used to think was quite a boring story. And now I'm 100% passionate about it. It's a story that you can share when in the front of a church. It's a story that you can share having coffee. It's a story that you can share over a cigarette if you smoke at break time. It's a story that you can share anytime, and you can share little bits of your testimony, even down to, and this is one thing that my wife does. Do you know, I was really stressing about getting a parking space, so I prayed and God supplied me with a parking space. Now that sounds crazy, but my wife is totally convinced that God supplies her with parking spaces. Not all the time, but just when she's really, really stressed about some place that she's going. And it baffles me why we don't share our testimony more. And it's one thing that we could all do at this time of lockdown. We could all share our testimony, because let's face it, you're talking to a video, you're talking to a screen, you're not talking to anybody in particular, and it doesn't matter whether it's 2 minutes flat or whether it's 22 minutes. I've recorded somebody's testimony which took 1 hour and 40 minutes. And he went through every single thing in his life. And I said to him at the end, there's about 38 testimonies in there. But he just wanted to unload everything. And it's one thing that I like doing, is getting people's testimonies, getting people's stories. Because everyone is different. Everyone is individual. And that's the thing that I think defeats Satan more than anything. He never knows what's coming. And it's something that pulls at other people's heartstrings, because they can see themselves in you. And they can see their own situation in your situation. And it really doesn't matter what situation you've been brought from. The fact is that you've changed. And if you've really given your life to God, then your friends and family will see the change. And it may be little things to start with, because we aren't always all going to change 100%, 180 degrees. We'll change little bit by little bit. And it may just be a matter of, first off, you stop pinching things from work. And that sounds terrible. But pinching a pen, pinching a rubber, pinching a stapler, it's all stealing. But it's just a matter of you change. And they'll want to know why you've changed. And so you explain to them, I've changed because I now have a relationship with God. And as that relationship grows, you will change more and more and more. So, in essence, one of the things that God has been prompting me with is sort of to start a little thing on our Sanctuary page, Sanctuary Wales, is to put up as many testimonies as we possibly can. And getting you to share your testimony will be an enormous thing. Because if you only ever share it on social media, then you never know who that's going to affect. But I guarantee you it will affect somebody. So please share your testimony. And if you don't want to put it on social media, just send it to me and I'll put it on our YouTube channel. And we can develop a whole bank of testimonies so that when somebody is unsure, they can go and look for a testimony, something like their own. And don't be bothered whether you're just a normal person who's come to God after years of being in church. Share your testimony. And hopefully this will allow you to become more comfortable with sharing your testimony. Because we should be as comfortable as anything with sharing about ourselves. We tend to talk 90% of the time about ourselves anyway, but when it comes to God, we are scared and we are frightened of what other people think. Who cares what other people think? What's the worst that they're going to say to you? Oh, I'm not into that God stuff. Oh, that's fine, nice for you. They're not seriously going to beat you up or torture you or kill you, which they will do in other countries. We are blessed by living in some of the greatest countries in this world. We are blessed by having the freedoms that we have. And yet we allow ourselves to be tied up by Satan's lies. Don't allow yourself to be tied up by Satan's lies. Don't allow yourself to be bamboozled into not sharing your testimony. Share your testimony. And remember, they triumphed over him. Him is Satan. They triumphed by the blood of the Lamb. That's you coming under God's protection. By the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Well, we aren't facing death. All we are facing is words. Share your testimony. Because your testimony is one of the greatest weapons that you have against Satan. And the more you share it, the more comfortable you will get at it. But the main thing is the more times you share it, the more triumph you will have over Satan. Amen. God bless.